Imagine standing on a windswept plain in western Turkey, looking out toward the sea. The ground beneath your feet is layered, literally layered, with the ruins of 9 separate cities, one built on top of the other, stretching back more than 4,000 years. Somewhere in those layers, something happened. Something violent enough, significant enough, and strange enough that people were still singing about it 8 centuries later. And those songs eventually became 2 of the most important works of literature in all of human history. The question is, what actually happened here? For most of the modern era, scholars assumed the answer was simple: nothing. The Trojan War was a myth, a beautiful myth, certainly, a culturally foundational myth, absolutely. But a myth nonetheless. Helen of Troy, the face that launched 1,000 ships, the wooden horse, the wrath of Achilles, these were the inventions of poets, not the records of historians. The Iliad and the Odyssey were great literature, but they were not history. Then, in 1871, a German businessman with a childhood obsession and a fortune made in the California gold rush walked onto that windswept plain in Turkey and started digging. His name was Heinrich Schliemann, and what he found would change the question entirely. But here is the thing about Schliemann's discovery, and about everything that has come since. The more archaeologists dig, the more historians analyze, the more linguists decode, the stranger and more complicated the picture becomes. Because it turns out the Trojan War question is not simply did it happen. The deeper question is, what kind of truth is buried inside these ancient poems? How much of the Iliad is memory and how much is myth? And what does the Odyssey, that wild, wandering story of one man trying to get home, actually tell us about the world that produced it? Those are the questions we are going to answer today, and the answers will take us from the ruins of a Bronze Age citadel to the collapse of an entire civilization, from the courts of Mycenaean kings to the dark centuries that followed, and finally to the moment when one of the greatest poems ever written was set down in ink for the first time. Let us start at the beginning. Or rather, let us start at the end, because the Trojan War, if it happened, did not happen in isolation. It happened at the end of an age, a very specific age that historians call the Late Bronze Age, and it was one of the most sophisticated, interconnected, and in many ways modern periods in the ancient world. To understand Troy, you have to understand what kind of world Troy existed in. Around 1200 BCE, the Eastern Mediterranean was dominated by a small number of great powers. Egypt under the pharaohs of the New Kingdom. The Hittite Empire in Anatolia, what is now Turkey. Mycenaean Greece, a collection of powerful palace states centered on cities like Mycenae, Tiryns and Pylos, and several other significant kingdoms: Ugarit on the Syrian coast, Assyria in Mesopotamia, Cyprus as a major hub of copper trade. These powers knew each other. They traded with each other. Their kings wrote letters to each other on clay tablets. We have those letters. We can read them. They are extraordinary documents. Kings addressing each other as brother, negotiating trade agreements, complaining about late shipments of tin and copper, occasionally threatening war. This was a world of long-distance trade, diplomatic marriages, shared technologies, and cultural exchange on a scale that would not be seen again in the Mediterranean for centuries. Merchants carried tin from as far as Afghanistan. Egyptian gold moved north. Mycenaean pottery turned up in Syria, in Egypt, in Anatolia. The Bronze Age was genuinely international. And then, around 1200 BCE, it all collapsed. Not gradually, not over centuries. Within a period of roughly 50 years, almost every major palace civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean was destroyed. Mycenae burned. Tiryns burned. Pylos burned, and we know this because the scribes at Pylos were apparently still writing on their clay tablets when the fire came, and the fire baked the tablets hard and preserved them. Ugarit was destroyed and never rebuilt. The Hittite Empire, one of the great superpowers of the ancient world, simply ceased to exist. Egypt survived, barely, but was permanently weakened. The trade networks collapsed. Writing disappeared in Greece, literally disappeared, for about 400 years. Historians call this the Bronze Age collapse, and it is one of the great unsolved mysteries of ancient history. What caused it? The honest answer is, we do not know for certain. There are several competing theories, and most serious scholars today believe the collapse was caused by a combination of factors: climate change and drought, disruption of trade networks, internal rebellions, earthquakes, and the mysterious sea peoples, raiders who appear in Egyptian records attacking from the sea. The exact weight of each factor is still debated. What is not debated is the scale of the destruction. The Bronze Age world ended, and a Dark Age followed. Troy sits right at the edge of this catastrophe. And that timing is not a coincidence. The site that Schliemann found in 1871, and that archaeologists have been excavating ever since, is called Hisarlik, a Turkish word meaning place of fortresses. It is a hill on the northwestern tip of Anatolia, near the entrance to the Dardanelles Strait, the narrow waterway connecting the Aegean Sea to the Black Sea. This location is not accidental. Whoever controlled this hill controlled the strait, and whoever controlled the strait controlled one of the most important trade routes in the ancient world. Schliemann was convinced from childhood that the Iliad was literally true. He had read Homer as a boy and never stopped believing. When he finally had the money to act on that belief, he came to Hisarlik and he dug with enormous enthusiasm and, unfortunately, very little archaeological care. He blasted through several layers of ruins looking for the Troy of Homer, and in his haste he destroyed significant evidence that later archaeologists would have given anything to study. He found a spectacular treasure of gold and silver objects, which he immediately declared to be the treasure of Priam, the Trojan king. He photographed his wife wearing what he called the jewels of Helen. He was wrong about almost all of it. The treasure he found belonged to a city that predated the Trojan War by about 1,000 years. But here is the thing. He was right about the big picture. There was a Troy. There had been many Troys, and one of them fit the time frame of the Trojan War almost perfectly. The site at Hisarlik has 9 main layers, labeled Troy 1 through Troy 9th, with various subphases. Troy I is the oldest, dating to around 3000 BCE. Troy 9th is the most recent, a Greco-Roman city that was still occupied in the early centuries of the Common Era. The layer that matters most for our story is Troy 7a. Troy 6th was a substantial, impressive city. It had massive walls, large towers, and a palace district. It showed clear signs of contact with Mycenaean Greece. Mycenaean pottery has been found there in significant quantities. This was a real city, a wealthy city, strategically located and clearly important. It was destroyed around 1300 BCE, probably by an earthquake. Troy the Athenia was built on the ruins of Troy VI. It was slightly less grand, but still significant. It shows signs of population increase, more houses, more storage vessels, signs perhaps of people crowding inside the walls. And it was destroyed by fire and violence around 1180 BCE. That date, roughly 1180 BCE, places the destruction of Troy the 7th right in the middle of the Bronze Age collapse, right in the window when the ancient world was falling apart, right in the time frame that ancient Greek tradition assigned to the Trojan War. Most archaeologists today consider Troy 7th the most likely candidate for the Troy of Homer. This is the mainstream scholarly view, though it is not without debate. Some scholars prefer Troy VI. A few remain skeptical that any specific layer corresponds to the Homeric story, but the evidence for a real, violent destruction of a real city at Hisarlik, at roughly the right time, is solid. So was there a Trojan War? Almost certainly, yes, in some form. Whether it was a 10-year siege over a stolen queen is a different question entirely. But there was a city at Hisarlik. It was destroyed by violence. The people who destroyed it came, in all likelihood, from the west, from Greece, and the memory of that destruction was preserved, transformed, mythologized, and eventually turned into the Iliad. But here is where it gets genuinely fascinating, because the Iliad was not written down immediately after the war, not even close. If the Trojan War happened around 1180 BCE, and if Homer composed the Iliad sometime around 750 to 700 BCE, which is the scholarly consensus, though even Homer's existence and the exact date of composition are subjects of ongoing debate, then there is a gap of roughly 400 to 500 years between the event and the poem. 400 to 500 years of oral tradition. Think about what that means. The Iliad is not a contemporary account. It is not even a near-contemporary account. It is a poem that was shaped, reshaped, expanded, compressed, and passed down through generations of singers, the oidoi, professional bards who performed from memory, across the dark centuries after the Bronze Age collapse. The world that produced the poem was radically different from the world the poem described. This is what the scholar Milman Parry realized in the 1930s when he traveled to Yugoslavia to study living oral poets. guslari, who composed and performed epic poetry from memory. Parry discovered that these singers did not memorize fixed texts. They composed in performance, using a vast repertoire of formulaic phrases, stock scenes, and narrative patterns that could be assembled and reassembled in different combinations. The wine-dark sea, the rosy-fingered dawn, Achilles as swift-footed. These repeated phrases in Homer are not poetic laziness. They are the building blocks of oral composition, metrical units that fit the rhythm of the verse and can be deployed whenever needed. This discovery, the oral formulaic theory, developed by Parry and his student Albert Lord, transformed how scholars understand Homer. The Iliad is not the product of a single genius sitting down to write a poem. It is the crystallization of a long oral tradition, probably shaped by many singers over many generations, before being fixed in something like its current form, possibly by a poet we call Homer, possibly in the 8th or 7th century BCE. What this means for historical memory is profound and complicated. On one hand, oral traditions can preserve surprisingly accurate details across long periods of time. Scholars have found that the Iliad contains genuine Bronze Age elements, details about armor, weapons, burial practices, and political geography that match the archaeological record of the Mycenaean world and do not match the world of Homer's own time. The heroes fight with bronze weapons in a poem composed in the Iron Age. They use large body shields that were characteristic of early Mycenaean warfare. They cremate their dead, which was a Bronze Age practice that had largely faded by Homer's time. These are not inventions. They are memories, preserved in the amber of oral tradition. On the other hand, oral tradition also distorts, mythologizes, and transforms. The gods intervening directly in battle are obviously mythological. The specific heroes, Achilles, Hector, Odysseus, Agamemnon, may be composites of real figures or entirely legendary, or somewhere in between. The cause of the war, a stolen queen, may be a mythological simplification of what was actually a complex political and economic conflict. The 10-year duration may be a narrative convention rather than a historical fact. Here is one of the most striking pieces of evidence for the historical core of the Trojan War, and it comes not from Greece but from the Hittites. In the Hittite archives, those remarkable clay tablet records preserved in the ruins of the Hittite capital, there are references to a place called Wilusa. Linguists have established with considerable confidence that Wilusa is the Hittite name for what the Greeks called Ilios, one of the two names Homer uses for Troy. The Iliad is set at Ilios. The Hittites had a city called Wilusa in exactly the right location, in northwestern Anatolia, and they had diplomatic dealings with it for centuries. There are also references in the Hittite texts to a people called the Ahiawa. For decades, scholars debated whether this was a reference to the Mycenaean Greeks, the Achaeans as Homer calls them. Today, the majority view is that it is. The Hittite texts describe the Ahiawa as a significant Western power, sometimes a rival, sometimes a trading partner. There are references to disputes over cities in western Anatolia, to Ahiawan warriors and leaders operating in the region, to political tensions that occasionally threatened to escalate into open conflict. None of this proves the Trojan War happened exactly as Homer describes it, but it does establish that the broad geopolitical situation Homer describes, Mycenaean Greeks in conflict with a city in northwestern Anatolia, was real. The stage was real. The actors were real. The specific drama may have been transformed by centuries of retelling, but it was not invented from nothing. And then there is the matter of what happened after the war, because the Trojan War, even if we accept its historical core, did not end with a Greek triumph and a happy homecoming. It ended with the beginning of the Bronze Age collapse. The world the Greek warriors returned to was already starting to unravel. Within a generation or two, the great palace cities of Mycenaean Greece would be burned and abandoned. The civilization that had launched the ships would cease to exist. This is the context in which we have to read the Odyssey. The Odyssey is Odysseus's story, the 10-year journey home from Troy to his kingdom of Ithaca. It is, on the surface, an adventure story. Monsters, witches, gods, a faithful wife, a son coming of age, a final reckoning with the suitors who have invaded his home. It is one of the most entertaining narratives in the ancient world, and it has never stopped being read. But the Odyssey is also something else. It is a document of memory and loss. And when you read it with the Bronze Age collapse in mind, it takes on a different resonance entirely. Consider what Odysseus encounters on his journey. He visits the land of the dead and speaks with the ghosts of the heroes of Troy. He finds Agamemnon, the great king of Mycenae, who was murdered by his own wife when he returned home. He finds Achilles, who tells him that he would rather be a living slave than a dead king. The world of the Iliad, the world of heroic glory and divine favor, is already becoming a ghost world, a world of the dead. The living world Odysseus moves through is stranger and more dangerous. He encounters the Cyclops, the one-eyed giant who does not know the laws of hospitality, who has no community, no civilization. He encounters the Lotus Eaters, who have lost all memory and all desire to return home. He encounters Circe, who turns men into animals. He encounters the Sirens, whose beautiful song leads to death. He passes between Scylla and Charybdis, the monster and the whirlpool, with no good option. Scholars have spent centuries trying to map Odysseus's route geographically, with wildly varying results. Some have placed his wanderings in the Western Mediterranean, some in the Black Sea. Some have argued the geography is entirely fictional. The honest answer is that no one knows, and the geography may not be the point. What matters is the texture of the world Odysseus moves through, a world where civilization is fragile, where the rules of hospitality and community can break down at any moment, where even memory itself is under threat. This is the world of the Dark Ages after the Bronze Age collapse. The interconnected, sophisticated, literate world of the Late Bronze Age was gone. What replaced it was smaller, more fragmented, more dangerous. Communities were isolated, trade networks had collapsed. Writing had disappeared. The great palaces were ruins. In this context, the Odyssey's obsessive concern with homecoming, with finding your way back to your community, your family, your identity, takes on a new meaning. There is a theory, developed by several scholars over the past few decades, that the Odyssey is not just a story about one man's journey home. It is also a kind of cultural memory of the collapse, a working through of the trauma of losing a world. The monsters and obstacles Odysseus faces may encode, in mythological form, the real dangers and disruptions of the post-collapse period. Piracy, the breakdown of trade routes, the encounter with peoples who did not share Greek cultural norms, the psychological disorientation of a world where the old certainties no longer applied. This is speculative, and it is worth being clear about that. It is an interpretive framework, not an established fact, but it is a framework that many serious scholars find compelling, and it gives the Odyssey a depth that goes beyond adventure story. Let us talk about one specific element of the Odyssey that has attracted particular scholarly attention: the geography of the Eastern Mediterranean as it appears in the poem. The Odyssey contains detailed knowledge of sailing routes, prevailing winds, coastal landmarks, and the locations of various peoples around the Mediterranean. Some of this knowledge is fantastic. The island of Aeolus, keeper of the winds, does not appear on any map, but some of it is surprisingly accurate. The Phoenicians, for example, appear in the Odyssey as skilled sailors and traders, which matches what we know about Phoenician maritime activity in the early Iron Age. The poem shows familiarity with Egypt, with Cyprus, with the general shape of the Mediterranean world. This has led some scholars to argue that the Odyssey, whatever its Bronze Age core, was also shaped by the experience of the early Iron Age Greeks as they began to re-expand across the Mediterranean, establishing trading posts and colonies in the 8th and 7th centuries BCE. The wandering of Odysseus may encode the experience of Greek sailors exploring and colonizing the wider Mediterranean world, the strangeness of new lands, the dangers of unfamiliar coasts, the longing for home. Again, this is interpretive, but it illustrates something important about how the Odyssey works as a historical document. It is not a record of one time period. It is a layered text, containing memories and experiences from multiple eras, the Bronze Age world it describes, the Dark Age oral tradition that preserved and transformed those memories, and the early Iron Age context in which it was finally fixed in something like its current form. Now let us talk about something that often gets overlooked in discussions of Troy and Homer, the question of who the Trojans actually were. In the Iliad, the Trojans are not portrayed as fundamentally different from the Greeks. They speak the same language, which is a narrative convention, obviously. Since the poem is in Greek, they worship the same gods, they have the same heroic values. Hector, the greatest Trojan warrior, is in many ways the most sympathetic character in the poem. He is a loving husband, a devoted father, a man who fights not for glory, but to protect his city and his family. He knows the war is probably lost. He fights anyway. This symmetry between Greeks and Trojans is one of the Iliad's most remarkable features. The poem does not present a simple story of good versus evil, of civilization versus barbarism. It presents a tragedy in which both sides suffer, both sides have heroes and cowards, and the gods play favorites in ways that seem arbitrary and cruel. But who were the historical Trojans? The evidence suggests they were probably Anatolian, part of the complex cultural world of Bronze Age Western Turkey, which had connections to both the Hittite world to the east and the Aegean world to the west. The pottery found at Troy Sevendaya includes both local Anatolian styles and Mycenaean Greek styles, suggesting a genuinely multicultural city at the crossroads of two worlds. Some scholars have proposed that the Trojans may have been related to or affiliated with the Luwians, an Anatolian people who spoke a language related to Hittite. There is a controversial but intriguing piece of evidence here, a bronze seal found at Troy Sevendaya in 1995, inscribed in Luwian hieroglyphics. This is the only writing found at Troy, and it suggests at least some connection to the Luwian world. But this evidence is limited, and its interpretation is debated. The picture that emerges is of Troy as a genuinely liminal place, between worlds, between cultures, between the great powers of the Bronze Age. Its destruction was probably not simply a Greek invasion. It was caught up in the larger catastrophe of the Bronze Age collapse, in which all the old certainties dissolved and the great powers fell one by one. Here is one of the great wow facts of this entire story, and it concerns the Linear B tablets. Linear B is the writing system used by the Mycenaean Greeks, the people who, if the Trojan War happened, launched the ships. It was deciphered in 1952 by a young British architect named Michael Ventris in one of the great intellectual achievements of the 20th century. The tablets written in Linear B are administrative records, inventories of goods, lists of workers, records of offerings to the gods. They are not literature, they are bureaucracy. But they are extraordinary bureaucracy, because they give us a window into the actual workings of the Mycenaean palace civilization, the civilization that Homer's heroes came from. And what they show is a world of remarkable sophistication and complexity. Specialized craftsmen, long-distance trade in luxury goods, elaborate religious festivals, large-scale agricultural management, and a warrior aristocracy that sounds, in certain ways, remarkably like what Homer describes. One tablet from Pylos lists offerings to the gods in what appears to be a moment of crisis. The offerings are unusually large, as if someone was desperately trying to secure divine favor. This tablet was being written when the palace burned. It is, in a very real sense, the last document of the Bronze Age world. The Linear B tablets also reveal something important about the relationship between the Mycenaean world and the world Homer describes. The names of several Homeric heroes appear in the tablets as common names in the Mycenaean period. Achilles, for example, appears as a name in Linear B records. This does not prove that the specific Achilles of the Iliad was a real person, but it suggests that the names Homer uses are genuinely Bronze Age names, not inventions of a later period. And then there is the matter of the gods. The Olympian gods, Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, Athena, Apollo, Ares, Aphrodite, all appear in the Linear B tablets. They were being worshipped in the Mycenaean palace cities. The religious world Homer describes is not an invention of the Iron Age. It has roots in the Bronze Age world that was destroyed in the collapse. This is perhaps the deepest layer of historical memory in Homer, not just the memory of a war, not just the memory of a world, but the memory of a relationship with the divine that stretched back to the earliest days of Greek civilization. Let us step back and look at the big picture for a moment, because we are now in a position to answer the questions we started with. Was the Trojan War real? The most defensible answer based on current evidence is there was almost certainly a real conflict, or series of conflicts involving Mycenaean Greeks and the city of Troy, the city at Hisarlik in northwestern Turkey, sometime around the late 13th or early 12th century BCE. The destruction of Troy Sevendaya around 1180 BCE by fire and violence, in the context of the broader Bronze Age collapse, is the most likely historical kernel of the Trojan War story. The Hittite records confirm that the geopolitical situation Homer describes, Greeks and Trojans in conflict over control of Western Anatolia, was real. What the war was actually about is less clear. The story of Helen and Paris, a war fought over a stolen queen, is almost certainly a mythological simplification of what were probably complex political, economic, and strategic motivations. Control of the Dardanelles Strait, access to Black Sea trade routes, competition over the rich agricultural lands of Western Anatolia, these are the kinds of motivations that drive real wars. A beautiful woman is the kind of motivation that makes a great story. How much history is hidden in the Odyssey? This is the more complex and in some ways more interesting question. The Odyssey contains genuine historical memory of the Bronze Age world, of the post-collapse Dark Ages, of the early Iron Age expansion of Greek civilization across the Mediterranean. But it contains these memories in transformed, mythologized, poetically elaborated form. It is not a historical document in any straightforward sense. It is something more interesting, a cultural memory, a working through of collective experience, a story that meant different things to different audiences in different periods. The Odyssey's concern with homecoming, with the difficulty and necessity of finding your way back to your community and your identity, spoke to audiences in the Dark Ages after the collapse, when the world had been turned upside down and the great certainties of the Bronze Age were gone. It speaks to audiences today, for reasons that are not so different. One more remarkable piece of this story deserves attention, and it concerns the question of how the Iliad and the Odyssey were actually preserved. We said that Homer composed or crystallized these poems around 750 to 700 BCE, but we do not have manuscripts from that period. The oldest complete manuscripts of Homer date to the medieval period, the 10th and 11th centuries of the Common Era. Between Homer's time and our oldest manuscripts, there are roughly 1700 years of copying, editing, and transmission. The story of how Homer survived is itself a remarkable piece of history. In the 6th century BCE, the Athenian tyrant Pisistratos is said to have organized the first official written text of Homer, establishing a standard version of the poems for performance at the Panathenaic festival. In the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE, the great scholars of the Library of Alexandria, men like Zenodotus, Aristophanes of Byzantium, and Aristarchus, produced critical editions of Homer, comparing different manuscript versions and trying to establish the most accurate text. Their work shaped the Homer we read today. This means that the Iliad and the Odyssey have been filtered through centuries of scholarly editing, copying, and transmission. The text we read is not exactly what Homer composed. If Homer composed anything in the sense we mean, it is the product of a long process of transmission and preservation that is itself a piece of history. And yet through all of that, the poems survive. They are still read. They are still taught. They still move people. The rage of Achilles, the grief of Priam, the longing of Odysseus for his rocky island home. These things have not lost their power across 3,000 years. Why? Partly because of the quality of the poetry, which is genuinely extraordinary, but partly because of something else, because the questions these poems ask are not Bronze Age questions. They are human questions. What is worth dying for? What is worth living for? What do we owe our community? And what do we owe ourselves? How do we hold on to our identity when the world around us is falling apart? How do we find our way home? These are the questions that the Bronze Age collapse forced on the survivors of that catastrophe. They are the questions that the Dark Age oral poets worked through in their songs. They are the questions that Homer, whoever Homer was, crystallized into two of the greatest poems ever written. And they are, in the end, our questions too. The ruins at Hisarlik are still being excavated. New discoveries are still being made. In 2018, a team of archaeologists announced the discovery of a large lower city at Troy, a settlement extending well beyond the citadel walls, much larger than previously thought, suggesting a city of perhaps 10,000 people at its height. This is significantly larger than the small citadel that earlier excavations had suggested. A city of that size, in that location, at that time, was a genuinely significant place, significant enough to be worth fighting over, significant enough to be remembered. The Linear B archives continue to be studied and reinterpreted. The Hittite records continue to yield new insights. New archaeological techniques, ground-penetrating radar, isotopic analysis, ancient DNA, are giving us tools that Schliemann could never have imagined. The picture is not complete. It may never be complete. The Bronze Age collapse destroyed too much, and 4,000 years is a long time. But the outline is clear enough. There was a Troy, there was a war, or something very much like one. And the memory of that war, transformed by centuries of oral tradition, became the foundation of Western literature. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, extraordinary. The next time you read the Iliad, or watch a film adaptation, or encounter a reference to the Trojan horse in a news article, or hear someone say that Helen had a face that launched 1,000 ships, remember what is underneath it. Remember the actual city on the actual hill, with its massive walls and its strategic location and its layers of destruction and rebuilding. Remember the Bronze Age world that produced it, sophisticated and interconnected, and then suddenly gone. Remember the Dark Age singers who kept the memory alive across 4 centuries without writing. Remember the scholars who preserved the text across another 17 centuries. And remember that history is not just what happened. It is the long, complicated, imperfect process by which what happened is remembered, transformed, and passed on. Troy is still speaking to us. We just have to know how to listen. If this story sparked something in you, that feeling of looking at a familiar myth and suddenly seeing the real world underneath it, then you might want to stick around on this channel. That is what we do. We go looking for the history inside the legend, the archaeology beneath the story, the human drama behind the dates and names. If you enjoyed this video, hitting the like button genuinely helps other people find it, and it tells me this is the kind of depth you are looking for. Subscribe if you want to be here when the next one drops, and leave a comment. Do you think the Trojan War happened? What part of this surprised you most? I read every comment, and the conversations in the section below are often as good as the video itself. The next video in this series goes even deeper into the Bronze Age collapse itself, the 50-year period when almost every major civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean fell apart simultaneously. It is one of the most dramatic and still mysterious events in all of human history. You will not want to miss it. But before we get there, let us sit with one more thread of this story that deserves its own moment, because it connects everything we have talked about in a way that feels almost too neat to be real, and yet the evidence is solid. It is the story of what happened to the Greek heroes after Troy. Not in the mythological sense, not the wanderings of Odysseus or the murder of Agamemnon, but in the historical sense. What happened to the civilization that launched the ships? The answer is, it destroyed itself. This is the part of the story that ancient Greek tradition preserved with remarkable clarity, even if it preserved it in mythological dress. The Greeks who sacked Troy did not return to a triumphant homeland. They returned to a world already fracturing. Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, was killed by his wife Clytemnestra and her lover Aegisthus. The palace at Mycenae was eventually abandoned. Pylos burned. Tiryns fell. The great network of Mycenaean palace civilization, which had taken centuries to build, collapsed within a generation of the Trojan War. The mythological tradition remembered this as a time of cursed families, divine punishment, and heroic tragedy. The historical record tells us it was something grimmer and more structural. Drought, disruption, internal conflict, the breakdown of the trade networks that kept the palace economies running. But the mythological memory and the historical reality are not as far apart as they might seem. Because what the myths are encoding, in their indirect way, is the experience of a civilization watching itself come apart. This is why the Odyssey begins not with adventure but with absence. Odysseus is missing. His home is being consumed by men who assume he is dead. His son Telemachus is growing up without a father, uncertain of his own identity and authority. His wife Penelope is weaving and unweaving her famous shroud, holding time in suspension, refusing to accept the reality that everyone around her insists upon. This is the image of a world waiting to see if what was lost can be recovered. And the answer the Odyssey gives, after 10 years of wandering, after monsters and gods and the underworld itself, is a qualified yes. Odysseus does come home, but the home he returns to is not the home he left. It has to be reclaimed through violence, through cunning, through the patient accumulation of recognition and trust. The restoration is real, but it is hard-won and incomplete. Scholars of oral tradition have noted that this pattern, the hero who goes away, the world that falls into disorder in his absence, the difficult homecoming, appears in cultures across the ancient world. It is one of the deep narrative structures of human storytelling. But in the specific context of post-collapse Greece, it carries extra weight. Because the Greeks of the Dark Ages were not just telling a story about one man coming home. They were telling a story about whether civilization itself could come home, whether the sophistication, the order, the identity of the Bronze Age world could somehow be recovered from the ruins. The answer history gave them was, not exactly, not the same thing, but something new could be built on the foundations of what was lost. And the poems themselves, the Iliad and the Odyssey, were part of that building. They were the cultural inheritance that the Dark Age Greeks preserved and passed on, the thread connecting the Iron Age world to the Bronze Age world it had descended from. There is something quietly astonishing about this when you hold it fully in mind. The people who composed and performed these poems in the Dark Ages, the anonymous singers who kept the tradition alive across 4 centuries without writing, were themselves living in the ruins of the world the poems described. They could look at the great stone walls of Mycenae, still standing but empty and silent, and know that the men who built those walls were the grandfathers of the heroes in their songs. They were singing about their own lost world, and they kept singing, generation after generation, in small communities scattered across the Greek-speaking world. The stories were told and retold. Details changed. Episodes were added and removed. The gods became more vivid, the heroes more complex, the geography more elaborate. The raw material of historical memory was worked and reworked until it became something that transcended history, something that spoke not just to the people who remembered the Bronze Age, but to anyone who had ever faced loss or war or the long road home. That is the deepest answer to our original question. How much history is hidden in the Odyssey? All of it, and none of it. The specific facts have been transformed beyond recovery. But the human truth underneath those facts, the truth about what it costs to fight a war, what it means to lose a world, what it takes to find your way back to yourself, that truth has been preserved with perfect fidelity. Homer, whoever Homer was, understood something that the best historians also understand, that the point of remembering the past is not to catalogue what happened, it is to understand what it meant. And what the Trojan War meant to the Greeks who fought it, to the Dark Age singers who remembered it, to the Iron Age audiences who first heard it performed, and to every reader since, is something that no amount of archaeology can fully excavate. It is buried too deep in us. If this video gave you something to think about, if it changed how you see the Iliad, or the Odyssey, or the whole strange relationship between myth and history, then please do share it. These are the kinds of stories that deserve a wider audience, and every share genuinely makes a difference for a channel like this one. Hit the like button if the depth and care that went into this is what you come here for. Subscribe so you do not miss what comes next, and drop a comment below. Tell me which part of this landed hardest for you, or what question you are still sitting with. The Bronze Age collapse video is coming, and if this one resonated, that one will too.